Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. For more than 3 decades, the truth sat buried beneath designer gowns, candlelit dinners, and the kind of carefully curated silence only this family could perfect. And on a quiet Los Angeles evening when the city lights blurred into something almost gentle, Taylor Hayes finally understood that she could no longer carry it alone. The Forrester mansion was unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes even the echo of footsteps feel too loud, and Ridge stood near the fireplace with his back turned, swirling a glass of untouched whiskey as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He had felt it all day, an unease he couldn't name, a weight pressing against his chest that had nothing to do with business or Brooke or the endless tug-of-war of his own heart. When Taylor asked him to meet her there, her voice trembling in a way it hadn't in years, he knew something was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the truth that would tear through his life like a fault line finally giving way. Taylor didn't sit. She couldn't. She stood a few feet behind him, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and when she finally spoke his name it sounded like a goodbye. Ridge turned, confused by the raw fear in her eyes, the same eyes that had once promised him safety, family, and forever. "Taylor, what's going on?" he asked, trying to soften his voice, trying to be the man she had once trusted with everything. She swallowed hard, the words burning her throat, and for a moment she looked past him, as if the walls themselves were witnesses she couldn't escape. "I need you to listen," she said. "Not as my ex-husband, not as Brooke's great love, but as the father of my children." That word, father, hung between them, sharp and sudden. Ridge frowned, a nervous laugh escaping him. "Okay," he said slowly. "You're scaring me." Taylor closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had shifted, something final. "Steffy isn't your biological daughter." The silence that followed was so complete it felt unreal, as if the world itself had paused to absorb the impact. Ridge stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to tell him this was some kind of psychological exercise, some metaphor gone wrong. But Taylor didn't blink. Her face crumpled instead, years of guilt and regret pouring out in a single devastating moment. "No," Ridge whispered. "No. That's not funny, Taylor." She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "I'm not joking. I never have about this. And I should have told you a long time ago." Ridge stepped back as if she'd struck him, his hand bracing against the mantel, his glass tipping and spilling whiskey onto the floor, the amber liquid pooling like the past he could never clean up. "You're saying after all these years, Steffy?" His voice broke on her name and Taylor nodded. "She's not yours, Ridge. She never was." Memories flooded him in violent waves. Steffy's first steps, the way she used to curl into his chest when she was scared, the pride he felt watching her become a force of nature in the fashion world, the fierce loyalty she showed him even when he didn't deserve it. "Then whose is she?" he demanded, anger finally cutting through the shock. Taylor hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. "It was a night I never meant to happen," she said quietly. "You and I were barely holding on. You were still tangled up with Brooke, and I felt invisible. I was vulnerable. And I made a mistake." Ridge's jaw clenched. "With who?" She met his eyes. "With Thorne." The name landed like a gunshot. Ridge laughed again, this time harsh and hollow. "My brother," he spat. "You're telling me Steffy is my brother's daughter?" Taylor nodded, shame etched into every line of her face. "Thorne never knew. I found out I was pregnant shortly after, and the timing made it easy to believe she was yours. And then, I couldn't destroy what little stability we had. So I stayed silent." Ridge turned away, pacing now, his hands running through his hair as decades of truth unraveled in seconds. "You let me believe she was mine," he said, his voice rising. "You let me raise her, love her, fight for her. And all this time," he couldn't finish. Taylor sobbed openly now. "I know. And I will regret it for the rest of my life." The sound of footsteps interrupted them, and before either could react, Steffy stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion and dawning horror. "Regret what?" she asked. Ridge froze. Taylor's breath caught in her throat. "Steffy," Taylor whispered. "You weren't supposed to hear this." But Steffy had already pieced it together. the fragments colliding into a truth so massive it made her dizzy. "Hear what?" she demanded, stepping forward. "Why does Dad look like his world just ended?" Ridge turned to her, his heart shattering all over again at the sight of the daughter. No, the woman he loved more than life itself. "Steph," he said softly, "there's something we need to talk about." Her gaze snapped to Taylor. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Taylor took a step toward her, reaching out, but Steffy pulled back. "Don't," she snapped. "Just tell me the truth." Taylor nodded, tears streaming. "Ridge isn't your biological father." Steffy stared at her, the words bouncing off her like they were spoken in another language. "That's not possible," she said. "Dad." Ridge's eyes filled with tears as he nodded slowly. "It doesn't change how I feel about you," he said quickly. "You're my daughter in every way that matters." But Steffi's world was already tilting, the foundation cracking beneath her feet. "Then who is?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Taylor closed her eyes. "Thorne Forrester." Steffi's breath hitched. "Uncle Thorne." She shook her head violently. No, that's insane." Her memories rewound, every interaction with Thorne suddenly colored with something darker, more complicated. "You let me grow up calling him uncle," she said, her voice rising. "You let me build my life on a lie." Ridge stepped forward. "Steffi, listen." "No," she shouted, backing away from both of them. "I don't know who either of you are right now." She turned and ran, the door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. Hours later, the news had already begun to ripple outward, as secrets always did in this family. Thorne was the next to hear it, summoned to Eric's office under the pretense of business, only to be blindsided by a truth he never saw coming. When Taylor told him, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to process the idea that the daughter he'd watched from afar, the niece he'd been proud of, was actually his. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I had a right to know." Taylor nodded. "You did. And I failed you too." Thorne sank into a chair, tears slipping free despite himself. "I missed her entire life." Meanwhile, Steffi wandered the streets of L. her phone buzzing nonstop with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. When she finally ended up at the Cliff House, Finn found her sitting on the floor, staring blankly at nothing. "Steffi," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" She looked up at him, eyes hollow. "I don't know who my father is," she whispered. Finn pulled her into his arms as the weight of that sentence settled over them both. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Ridge and Thorne confronted each other, decades of rivalry and resentment igniting into something raw and painful, while Brooke watched from the sidelines, torn between sympathy and the undeniable realization that Ridge's past with Taylor had just rewritten itself entirely. Eric struggled with guilt of his own, wondering how he had missed the truth for so long, while Steffi faced the impossible task of redefining herself at 30 years old. Yet in the midst of the chaos, one truth remained unshaken. Ridge might not be Steffi's biological father, but he was the man who had shown up every day, who had loved her fiercely, who had shaped the woman she became. And as the Forrester family stood on the brink of another irreversible change, the question was no longer who Steffi's father was by blood, but whether love could survive the truth after 30 years of lies. The following morning, the Forrester mansion was eerily quiet, though the tension within its walls was thicker than any storm that Los Angeles skies could muster. Ridge had barely slept, and when he finally rose, the weight of Taylor's confession still pressed against him like an immovable force. The idea that Steffi, the daughter he had raised, loved, and fought for all these years, was not his biological child, twisted his chest in ways words could not contain. Every memory of her, her first steps, the sleepless nights, the proud moments on the runway, now shimmered with a complicated haze of truth and betrayal. Taylor's words, "She's Thorne's," had not only rewritten history but had shaken the very foundation of his identity as a father. Ridge moved through the house like a man in a fog, the golden morning light catching on the polished wood floors but offering him no warmth, no comfort. He found himself in the living room where photographs of Steffi as a child lined the mantel. He stared at them, each picture a snapshot of love, now tainted by revelation. "How could I not have known?" he whispered, the words almost lost to the emptiness around him. Taylor emerged from the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, her eyes red-rimmed and weary. She approached him cautiously. "Ridge," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I know this is hard, but you need to understand." "I do understand," Ridge interrupted, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "I understand that you kept this from me for decades. That you let me raise a child who wasn't mine, who belonged to my brother." He spun toward her, and for the first time in years, his anger was raw and palpable. Taylor flinched, but she held her ground. "It wasn't easy for me either," she said quietly. "Every day I wondered if I should tell you, if I should risk everything, but I was scared. Scared of hurting Steffy. Scared of losing the family we had. I thought I was protecting her, and protecting you." Ridge ran his hands through his hair, pacing the room in agitation. "Protecting me? Taylor, you call this protection? You've shattered my world." Meanwhile, Steffy had taken refuge at the Cliff House, her mind racing and heart pounding with a cocktail of anger, confusion, and grief. Finn sat beside her, gentle yet steadfast, offering her the kind of support that Ridge and Thorne, both men caught in their own storm of guilt, could not provide at that moment. "Steffy," Finn began carefully, his voice soft but firm, "I know this is insane. I can't even imagine how it feels. But you're not alone." She shook her head, tears spilling freely. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said, voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "Everything I believed about my family, about myself, was a lie." Finn held her hand tightly. "No, not everything. You're still Steffy Forrester. You're the same amazing, brilliant, strong woman you were yesterday. You're still loved by Ridge, by Thorne, by me." Back at the mansion, Thorne arrived shortly after Ridge and Taylor's confrontation, summoned by Eric under the pretense of urgent family matters. When Taylor revealed the truth to him, his reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and profound emotion. "All these years," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "All those birthdays, school plays, every milestone. I watched her from afar because I thought she was Ridge's. And now," his voice faltered, "I missed everything." Taylor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know. You had no idea. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't. And I will carry that guilt forever." Thorne sank into a chair, his mind a whirlwind of what-ifs, wondering how this revelation would ripple through the already tangled web of Forrester relationships. The news of Steffy's paternity began to spread like wildfire through the Forrester inner circle. Brooke, always one step removed from Taylor's confessions yet intimately tied to Ridge's life, struggled with her own mix of emotions. Relief that Ridge was not fully trapped by Taylor's decades of secrets warred with guilt for being part of the family tension, and curiosity about how this revelation would affect Steffy's sense of self. When she confronted Ridge later that day, her voice carried a mixture of care and exasperation. "Ridge, I don't know how you're even standing right now," she said. "But remember, no matter what, Steffy needs her father. You may not be her biological dad, but you are her dad." Ridge's expression softened briefly at Brooke's words, though the storm inside him was far from calm. That evening, the mansion was tense as the family attempted to gather for an emergency dinner, though it was clear no one could escape the gravity of the revelation. Ridge remained silent, picking at his food while Taylor tried, unsuccessfully, to bridge the gap she had caused. Thorne arrived, pale and exhausted from his own emotional turmoil, and Steffy, despite her reluctance, made her way back to face the family she had always known as her own, even if the truth had twisted her reality. The dinner conversation was fractured, polite on the surface but charged underneath. Eric attempted to mediate, attempting to remind everyone that blood did not define family. Yet even he knew the truth would linger like an invisible storm cloud over every interaction. The days that followed were filled with confrontation, reflection, and fragile attempts at reconciliation. Steffy oscillated between rage at the secrecy that defined her entire life and gratitude for the love she had always felt from Ridge. Thorne, suddenly catapulted into the role of biological father, struggled with guilt for missing 30 years of his daughter's life. Ridge, meanwhile, navigated the painful duality of being both betrayed and devoted, realizing that fatherhood had always been about presence, commitment, and love rather than biology alone. Taylor, burdened with decades of secrecy, faced the harsh reality that her confession had not brought relief, but a complex maze of consequences she could not undo. Eventually, the family began tentative steps toward understanding. Steffy allowed herself moments of vulnerability with Ridge, acknowledging the depth of his love and the sacrifices he had made, while still grappling with the knowledge that Thorn was her father by blood. Thorn, humbled and emotional, began to forge a relationship with Steffy, mindful of the years lost yet determined to make up for the absence he could never fully reconcile. Taylor, standing in the background of every interaction, felt the bittersweet weight of truth, finally freed from secrecy but aware that love, even when honest, could not erase the pain of betrayal. The revelation of Steffy's true paternity became more than a scandal. It became a catalyst for reevaluation, for confronting past mistakes, and for understanding that family is defined by actions, presence, and heart as much as by biology. While secrets had long shaped the Forrester family, the courage to face them head-on marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where honesty, though painful, allowed space for healing, reconciliation, and the possibility that love, tested and strained, could ultimately endure. By the end of the week, Steffy had taken the first tentative steps toward integrating the truth into her identity. She confronted Thorn with a mixture of anger and curiosity, asking questions about the life she could have had with him present. Ridge, despite his own lingering hurt, provided steady support, a constant reminder that fatherhood was more than blood. Taylor observed quietly, her heart heavy with regret yet lighter in its honesty, and the family, fractured but not broken, began the slow, delicate process of rebuilding the trust that had taken 30 years to unravel. The tension in the Forrester mansion didn't fade with the passage of hours. If anything, it thickened, settling into every corner like dust that refused to be shaken away. Steffy had returned home, but the air between her and Ridge was strained, a quiet storm threatening to break at any moment. She moved through the house with a careful precision, avoiding Ridge's gaze whenever possible, yet feeling every glance he threw her way like a tether pulling at her heart. Ridge, in turn, tried to maintain his composure, but each time he saw her, the flood of conflicting emotions threatened to drown him. Love, betrayal, anger, and guilt collided inside him like waves crashing against the cliffs of Malibu, and no amount of rational thought could quiet the turmoil. Thorn, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile decades of absence with the reality of the daughter he had just discovered. He had spent hours in his office, staring at the photographs of Steffy as a child, trying to memorize the curves of her smile, the tilt of her head, the way she had always mirrored Ridge's expressions without knowing the truth. The weight of his own failures pressed down on him. "How could I have missed all this?" he muttered, voice rough with emotion. 30 years. And now I'm expected to just step in? Taylor had tried to comfort him, but her words felt hollow even to her. She understood his pain better than anyone. She carried it too, but the reality was that time lost could never be returned. Steffy's confrontation with Finn that evening was equally raw. She had spent the day oscillating between rage and confusion, and when Finn found her alone in her room, she collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the sheets as if they were the only thing keeping her anchored. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she admitted, her voice shaking. Finn sat beside her, taking her hands in his, steady and grounding. "You're still Steffy Forrester," he said gently. "You're still the same woman you've always been. Blood doesn't define that, it never did." But Steffy shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's not just about blood, Finn. It's the betrayal, the lies, my entire life built on deception. How do you move past that?" Finn held her tighter, understanding that words could only do so much. "One day at a time," he said softly. "Start with the people who love you. Start with the truth, even if it hurts." Later that evening, Ridge and Thorn finally faced each other in the grand office at Forrester Creations, the tension between them electric. "So all this time," Ridge began, his voice tight, You were the father I never knew existed?" Thorn ran a hand over his face. "I wasn't there, Ridge. I didn't know. And now I see what I've missed. And I don't know where to go from here." Ridge shook his head, frustration and heartache mingling in his expression. "You can't just step in now and expect it to be the same. 30 years of history, 30 years of us gone." Thorn's eyes filled with tears, but there was also a spark of determination. "I don't want to replace you," he said. I want to be part of her life. I want her to know me too." Ridge's jaw clenched, a storm of conflicting emotions raging inside him. "This isn't easy for me, Thorne," he admitted. "I've loved her every day of her life. But this changes everything." Meanwhile, Taylor retreated to her study, sitting quietly with a cup of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. The house felt emptier than ever, though it was filled with people. She knew she had done the right thing by telling the truth, yet guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. She had hoped honesty would heal, would lift the weight she had carried for so long, but instead it had unleashed a cascade of pain, fracturing the family she loved. And yet, deep down, she also knew this was a necessary step. Secrets had a way of poisoning everything over time, and for the first time in decades, the Forrester family was confronting the consequences of the lies they had unknowingly built their lives around. By nightfall, the mansion was quiet once again. Steffy lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's revelations in her mind. Ridge sat alone in the living room, staring at a photo of Steffy as a toddler, the love he felt for her mingling painfully with the knowledge of the truth. Thorne had retreated to his office, going over every detail he could remember, every memory that connected him to Steffy, trying to find a way to bridge 30 years of absence. And Taylor finally allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing that while the past could not be undone, the family could still survive. Maybe, just maybe, the truth, though painful, could lead them toward something stronger, something real. Even in the chaos, one thing was clear: the Forrester family would never be the same again. But amidst the heartbreak, the anger, and the confusion, there remained a glimmer of hope, a chance for healing, for reconciliation, and for a love that could endure even the most devastating of truths.